Okay, so yeah, this is the earthly realm. You got the circular jade piece with the bee, known as the bee, the dragons intertwined in it. This is a close-up of it there. So the bee is that circular shape that the dragons are kind of nodding through, and there are little bumps on it that represent like a texture that an actual bee would have. This is kind of an example of one. And it seems like these were used for some kind of astronomical observations. Um, they persist like throughout the various Chinese dynasties, even though their actual purpose may have been lost. They become just kind of stylized elements. And then there's silk basically hanging down from the bee with a stone chime, just like we saw in the lithophone there. Um, and then there's a pair of fish below that in the underworld realm, whose bodies form another bee. There's ritual bronzes here that would contain food and wine for the deceased, kind of appropriate to the underworld. But yeah, you can see that stone chime, just like we saw in the lithophone there. So Taoism is one of the philosophies that emerges during this period. The primary text is the Tao Te Ching, and then a secondary text is the Zhuangzi. Most of you guys are probably familiar with the yin yang symbol that emerges from Taoism, but it emerges from the Han period. It's kind of like a contrast to the Confucian philosophy of public order and filial piety. The Tao is kind of like a way of connecting with nature. So yeah, Confucianism is this rational political philosophy. Taoism is more about individuality, nonconformity, in connection with nature. So the Han Dynasty was pretty prosperous and peaceful. It's a unified China. There are some artworks that reflect these Taoist ideals that kind of flourished during the period. There's a legend of an island of immortals, and investigations of immortality were pretty common at this time. But there's a bronze incense burner that relates to this legend here. So this is from the tomb of Prince Liu Sheng, and this is supposed to represent that island of the immortals, kind of like a really stylized, craggy outcropping coming up out of the sea. And you got to imagine the incense smoke would be kind of coming up through these kind of like irregularly shaped holes in the lid, which would make it look like it was shrouded in mist. So would have had a really cool effect with the incense coming out of it. So this was found in a pretty elaborate tomb, just like the other ones that we've seen so far. This is a cool in situ shot of it there. And the most fantastic object, at least in my opinion, that comes out of this tomb is this crazy jade burial suit for the nobleman's wife. So you can see it's like a whole suit made of jade panels. You can see the large jade bees that were buried with her there, but like a really stunning and, I would say, enigmatic work of art. And these are just some of the other kind of like rich ritual goods that were buried in the tomb, including these really fantastic stylized jade objects, including a cicada, and this is supposed to be a pig. This is just a close-up of the incense burner. So you can see some of the holes where the incense smoke would have emerged in the kind of stylized mountain landscape there. And that's the complete object. So Confucianism was kind of like the state religion. We'll look at a rubbing of a low relief from the Wu family shrine that kind of embodies these Confucian ideas. Confucianism is based on basically like justice, etiquette, all of these kind of ideas about proper human interaction. And we can see some of them embodied in this low relief from the Wu family shrine. So this is basically like a rubbing that was taken of a stone bas relief. So the paper was placed over the relief and then dusted with ink to kind of transfer the image onto the paper. But we can see three registers. At the bottom, there are horses and carriages approaching. The horses are all in the same pose, but each carriage is kind of distinct and individualized. And the horses are supposed to be like fancy imported Arabian horses that emphasize the wealth of the Wu family, which was important for the status of their deceased family members in the afterlife. And then in the middle register, we can see people approaching an emperor and bowing to him. We can also see a chariot with the horse kind of disconnected from it. And this is a mythical world tree with the sunbirds being shot by the kind of legendary Archer Yi. And that goes back to like an ancient Chinese legend about how there used to be 10 suns in the sky until Archer Yi shot 9 of them to save the world from a drought. But there's a Confucian saying that there are not 2 suns in the sky, which is supposed to be about leadership, basically there being like one absolute ruler. So that's like a reference to the emperor. And then up here we can see above the emperor and empress who's like living in seclusion, which is like another example of like a Confucian ideal. There's some pretty interesting techniques for showing space in this image. Here we can see 2 people bowing to the emperor, but they're not overlapping. They're shown in what's called like vertical perspective. Although like if we look right below them, we can see that the artist did understand overlapping with the 2 horsemen there. The artist also understood diminution of size to show depth. So there's 3 different techniques for showing depth in the same composition. This is Archer Yi, who's off to the side there. He's shooting the 9 sunbirds out of the magic world tree there. Architecture, there's no Han architecture that survives, but there are ceramic models. And this is an example of them. Up at the top, you can see bracketing, which is one of like the most interesting features of this building. And that's something that's going to be on the quiz, that the most interesting feature of the building is the bracketing. And I can try to draw that for you guys right there. Yeah, those are the brackets, basically hold the roof on. And this is a really nice example of one of these ceramic models of Han. A Han watchtower is basically what it is. You can see the guys with crossbows in there. But this one is at the BMA. It also has that same bracketing on the roof that you can see there. So there's a collapse of the Han dynasty where China gets broken up into 3 warring kingdoms. This is known as like the 6 dynasties period, and the Confucian system sort of loses influence. Because it's kind of chaotic, there's an opening for Buddhism to kind of flourish in China. There's not a lot of painting that survives from the 6 dynasties period. For the Chinese, brush marks were like kind of like the ultimate measure of quality. This is an example of painting from the period that does actually show Confucian values. It's basically a guidebook for how noble women should behave themselves. So basically what we're seeing is like a circus bear attacking the emperor. And this woman, who's one of his wives, basically is standing in between her husband and the bear. So that's an example of her performing her Confucian duty. These are some other pages from the same book by the same artist, but they're kind of interesting in that they show the lives of women during the time period. Calligraphy is a really important art form in China. It's supposed to reveal the character of the writer. The type of calligraphy that we're going to look at right now is by Wang Jizi, and it's a type known as Fengju, which is kind of like not as formal as seal script, a little bit more relaxed and easygoing. But yeah, this is like a really nice example of Fengju. You can see that it is like fairly fluid. The Fengju is in the black, and then the red are the stamps of different connoisseurs and scholars that have viewed the scroll. And that's done in that seal script that we saw on the oracle bones and the bells during the Bronze Age dynasty. So that's like a more formalized, rigid script in contrast to the kind of flowing brushwork of the Fengju. And in China, these kind of like red stamps from connoisseurs and other people that had viewed the artwork weren't considered to be like graffiti or anything like that. It was supposed to add to the quality of the artwork. So yeah, Buddhism is kind of coming from India. It offers kind of like salvation in the afterlife. Um, that's part of why it was appealing during this kind of politically chaotic period. Um, One of the best examples of Buddhist art that survives from this period is a giant seated Buddha from a rock-cut cave, Cave 20 at Yonggang. You can see the Buddha there. And there are some attributes of the Buddha that we'll talk about um, in the next couple chapters. You can see that he has like a large bump on his head. That's called an Ushnisha. That may be because he was basically born as a prince and wore a crown. Can see if I can get some other images there. It's very stylized and simplified. He has kind of a serene expression. In this image, you can see that he has like elongated earlobes. That is again because he grew up as a prince and he would have worn like heavy earrings that stretched out his earlobes. He's got a simple monk's robe on that's kind of stylized. Behind him, you can see that he has a halo, and those are other Buddhas. There are multiple Buddhas in the Buddhist cosmology that come at different times. So they show up quite a bit in different forms. This is again the Buddha, same figure. He's showing a couple of hand gestures called mudras. The hand that's up like this is supposed to mean don't be afraid, and then the hand that's down on the other side is supposed to represent generosity. But you can see that he has the same like kind of stylized simple robe, the elongated earlobes, and the bump on the top of the head. And here you can see the other Buddhas in the meditation poses behind him. And in the top left here, you can see a bodhisattva. So bodhisattvas are like future Buddhas that are putting off achieving nirvana and enlightenment so they can help other people on earth. And they typically wear, instead of like the simple monk's robe, they wear princely garments. So they have like jewelry, fancy clothes, stuff like that. And this is just another shot of the Buddha off to the side. And then just like a longer shot. The Sui dynasty was really short-lived. They paved the way for the Tang, which was like a pretty strong dynasty. In the Sui dynasty, we see this emergence of like Amitabha Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism, which basically offered people the belief that they would be reincarnated in kind of like a worldly paradise with the Amitabha Buddha. And this is an altar to him. You can see basically he's seated on a lotus throne. There are two bodhisattvas on either side of him. He's seated under like a tropical tree. But basically what you need to know for the quiz is this is the Amitabha Buddha, the one that offers like reincarnation in basically like a heavenly paradise. Another shot of it there. This is also the Amitabha Buddha. This is done in wood with painted lacquer on top of it. So lacquer is made basically like a plant-based liquid that kind of dries into a solid. And you can see the paint there. This is also from the Sui dynasty. You can check out some of the attributes of this one, which is at the Walters. This is the oldest known surviving Chinese example of this type. So yeah, it's basically built up with layers of cloth and lacquer. That technique is known as jaizu, and that is going to be on the quiz. It's called jaizu whether or not it has a wooden core. This one's actually hollow, as we'll see. So he's wearing like the three garments specified for the Buddhist monkhood: an undercloth, a robe, and a shawl. They're kind of like stylized here. So this is the back, and you can see that this is actually hollow. It has like kind of like a secret storage compartment that would have held like rolls of cloth, boxes of lacquer, something like that. So yeah, the lacquer is initially kind of runny. They would mix bone into it to make it a little bit more solid. Um, this is a microscopic image showing the bone particles. That's another thing that's going to be on the quiz, that the lacquer was mixed with bone. Um, this is just a close-up here. You can see the remnants of the paint on the lacquer in his kind of meditative state. He's in a meditation pose. You can see that he's got like really good posture, and his chest is kind of swelling as he's like breathing in, right? So that's part of the meditation, is like breath control. The meditation pose that he's in, that's going to be on the quiz. That's known as Dhyana. And his hands were in a gesture. The different gestures of the Buddha are called mudras. He's probably in the meditation gesture called the Dhyana mudra. So the mudras are these symbolic hand gestures. They're kind of a way of reading the iconography of a Buddhist work of art. This is the Dhyana mudra, which symbolizes meditation and balance, showing the path towards enlightenment. The lower hand represents Maya, the physical world of illusion, the world that we're in. And the upper hand represents Nirvana, which is enlightenment and release from the world. We can see the other attributes of the Buddha here, the Ushnisha, the cranial protuberance, which is interpreted different ways. We talked about how it could be from wearing a crown. The other interpretation is that it's a mark of his enlightenment. And this is just a side view where you can see like his lungs expanding from the breath control. And there's a little bit of stylization of the fabric, although each loop of the fabric is unique. So yeah, this is a really nice example of an Amitabha Buddha. And just some other examples of the Dhyana mudra from similar sculptures. So the Tang dynasty comes after the Sui dynasty. They're still into the Pure Land Buddhism. It's really appealing to people. This is a good example of this type of Buddhist art from the Tang dynasty. We can see the Amitabha Buddha in his paradise, which has like palaces in the background and ornate gardens. The Nanshan Temple is a good example of architecture from this period. There's basically like a type of modular architecture based on modules. So it's like a simple post and lintel construction that they could duplicate and expand outward to make a building. The Great Wild Goose Pagoda, another pretty good example of Buddhist architecture from the period. It's basically a combination of the Han Watchtower and the Indian stupa, which is a type of Buddhist temple that we'll look at later in the semester. It's made entirely of brick. It's a quiz question. So it imitates a wooden building, but it's made of brick. So yeah, pagodas, like I said, kind of a combination of a Han Watchtower and an Indian stupa. You can sort of see the evolution and combination of the two forms in this diagram. There's not a lot of Tang scroll paintings that survive. This is actually like a copy of one, but it shows women preparing silk. So it's kind of interesting in that way. But there is a lot of Tang sculpture that survives, particularly ceramic sculpture, which shows like kind of liveliness and naturalism, and this beautiful like 3-color glazing technique. This is a cool example. We can see a camel carrying a group of musicians, and you can see one has like this guitar-like instrument that's called a pipa in China. But what makes this a good example of Tang Dynasty art is that like foreigners are depicted. In the Tang Dynasty, they were really interested in foreign or exotic culture. So the camel itself is kind of an exotic animal that would have been brought in from the Silk Road. And then the standing musician, as well as the one playing the pipa, are Central Asian. They're not Chinese. So it's kind of like a cosmopolitan group of musicians. So like one of the things that we see in Tang sculpture are these depictions of foreigners, particularly Central Asians. This is another one here. You can see that they basically are meant to represent a different type of people. It's a nice one there. He's got a wineskin, but you can see his nose has kind of like an aquiline form. His eyes are rounder. It's basically supposed to represent a Central or South Asian person. And this is another one riding a similarly exotic camel. Two equestrian figures are a good example of Tang Dynasty art. These are Chinese figures, but it shows that women took part in horsemanship and sports. A couple other examples. But yeah, the Tang Dynasty sculpture is kind of known for this liveliness and exuberance. You can see the glaze really nicely here. They were into letting it kind of run down the side of the form. A couple musicians there. So the Tang Dynasty collapsed, and then the Song Dynasty is the next one. So they weren't as interested in like foreign or exotic culture, kind of turned inward, and they make really beautiful paintings. It's a pretty interesting Bodhisattva, seated Guan Yin Bodhisattva. So this is one of those kind of like Buddhist saints, future Buddhas that postpone their enlightenment to help others. And there's a couple different ways that we can tell this is a Bodhisattva and not a Buddha. The first is the kind of like princely garments instead of the monk's robe. And then the second is the pose. He's sort of seated in this pose called royal ease instead of a meditation pose. So that's kind of a reference to like South Asian princes. We can see that he does have like the Ushnisha and the elongated earlobes that we see from the Buddha. Neo-Confucianism is kind of like a return of Confucianism during the period. We see some influences of that idea in Northern Song painting, which are basically like landscape paintings that are meant to not really show a particular place, but kind of like ideal forms in nature. Fan Quan, this is a pretty nice example. Travelers among mountains and streams. It's a little bit hard to see in this image, but there's a waterfall and like a small little wagon train at the bottom. It's an interesting way of creating depth with the kind of band of fog that separates the foreground from the background. This is a detail where you can see that like really delicate little waterfall. And then you can see the wagon or the pack train down in the foreground, as well as like a little temple up in the upper right. And this is a close-up of that really minuscule little pack train. So Chinese painters usually avoided linear perspective, although we can see some examples of what they call ruled line painting. This is a nice example of a Northern Song Dynasty painting, this mountain landscape with people fishing. And again, these aren't supposed to be like particular mountains, but basically like an idealized one. This next one is a good example of the ruled line painting. You can sort of see like a pretty convincing illusion of depth. It's a lively riverside scene with merchants and boats. What we're seeing is basically like a boat with like a large mast getting ready to go under this bridge. So the sailors are like taking the mast down to dip under the bridge. So basically the Southern Song emerges after the fall of the Northern Song. There's like a barbarian invasion and a bunch of people have to flee south. But the Southern Song type of painting is a little bit different. It's less about naturalism and more about kind of like the character of the artist flowing into the artwork. So this is a nice example by Jia Gui. So Chinese painting is experienced a little bit differently than Western painting. Instead of a painting being up on a wall to be kind of observed by a group of people, Chinese painting is done in a scroll and it's meant to be observed by one person in private. And they basically would unfurl the scroll to view it like one bit at a time. And they would go from right to left instead of left to right. So you wouldn't perceive the whole thing at once, and it's meant to be viewed from multiple vantage points. But this is a really nice example of Southern Song painting. You can see that there's kind of like a looser brush style, pretty interesting atmospheric perspective, and this kind of like ethereal, unearthly quality to it. Ceramic during this period, we see guanware, and one of the hallmarks of guanware is this kind of crackled glaze that you can see here. Korean art, there's a few different periods that we'll look at. During the Three Kingdoms period, Korea is not unified. There's these three individual kingdoms. They also put like kind of lavish ritual objects in tombs. This crown is a good example. It has like little jadeite decorations on it, and it's made of gold. They made ceramic stands for offering food to the deceased. This is an example of one. It does have snakes on the side. And this is a really nice example of painting from the time period, or sorry, rather sculpture. It's a bodhisattva in meditation. The Silla dynasty unifies the peninsula. They build this really fantastic Buddhist temple in a cave. You can see the Buddha meditating there. Celadon glazed ceramics are imported from China, but they developed their own technique. This is a great example of a Meibyong bottle, and you can see that the design is done in that Celadon technique. This is a Buddhist painting, sorry. You can see a bodhisattva. It's the same bodhisattva that we saw the sculpture of Guan Yin. And that's it. That's Korean art as well as Chinese art.